The transition to adulthood is generally marked when a young adult leaves the home, goes out, and works full-time. This transition has become increasingly more challenging these days with the changing workforce and the global economy. And for those of you out there know that when suffering with ASD, it gets even harder. And that's why we are here today. Welcome to this Autism Ontario webinar. My name is Matthew Lay. I am going to be your host. And we will be discussing transitioning to adulthood, employment strategies and life skills for teens and young adults with ASD. We are very lucky to have on the desk with us today Patricia O'Connor and Sarah Duhaime, two of the utmost experts in Ontario on the subject. And on this webinar, as always, we will aspire to answer your questions, as well as talk about the successes that each of them have had in their practices, give you as parents and caregivers some strategies for helping with this transition, talk about where to get help in the province of Ontario, and much more. But before we get to that, I've got some housekeeping items that I need to discuss. First and foremost, a big part of what we do here is getting you answers to your questions. And so we want you to be submitting your questions throughout the presentation in the Ask a Question box, which is directly below me on the webcast console. Those questions will come into my iPad, and I will aspire to get you the answers. Now, there's a lot of you out there and not a lot of time. And so Autism Ontario has committed that those answers that we don't get to you live today, we will find a way of getting them to you afterwards. Beside the video window is a slide window. It will be transitioning throughout today's broadcast, providing you with more insight into what we are discussing. And you can get even more insights by going to the resource widget at the bottom of the console, where you can download and access websites, download documents that are all add color to what we're talking about. Last but not least, if you have any issues, click on the Help button. And with that out of the way, it is my pleasure to welcome Sarah and Patricia to the desk. Thanks for coming out, guys.
Thanks for having us.
To get started, Sarah, can you talk to us a little bit about your practice at the Redpath Centre and what that entails?
Sure. So the Redpath Centre is located in Toronto, and we served almost 600 different individuals last year. It is a fee-for-service type of therapy, and people go through and receive formal assessments, occupational therapy, psychotherapy, coaching, all kinds of different supports that may be helpful for someone living on the spectrum.
Okay, beyond being on the spectrum, who are you typically seeing on a day-to-day basis?
So we work with people who have formal diagnoses and some who do not. Also people who relate to mental health conditions and learning disabilities. Primarily, I see individuals most commonly between the ages of 18 to 35, and I do more of a coaching, employment coaching specific type of support. So usually those people are in transition. They oftentimes possess some college or university, or maybe even a full degree, maybe even a graduate degree. Other times they do just have their high school, but the commonality is usually they're very socially anxious and socially isolated, and they've had some time on their own, not really involved in the community as much as one would hope. Very limited experience. So
at the beginning, we saw your title, had all the letters at the end of it. You come from an employment coach background. What is your background?
Yeah, so about 8 years ago, I used to work in employment counseling at a local employment resource center. Had a few years experience there with my background being in labor studies. And then I did a master's in social work, really learned a lot about autism and combined those two pieces, and have been at Redpath now for almost 6 years.
Okay. Now, Patricia, you come at this problem, if you will, from a different perspective. You're a former educator with a fascinating story. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. I retired from education in 2010. And at that point, I thought I was going to do a little bit of work in autism spectrum, just with autism spectrum disorders. But my plans changed since I heard from many folks, many families that had young adults that were just graduating from school and secondary school, and they wondered what was next. And honestly, I didn't know. So I started to do research. And what I found was not much. There were no programs for this population. And so I started to work on a program called Transition to Life at that point. And I approached Autism Ontario and Marg Spoelstra for support. We applied for an Autism Speaks grant in 2012 and were successful. And at that point, I started to prepare to do a pilot course. I wrote the course and started to prepare to do a pilot course. And Since then, that was very successful, and since then I have also applied once again to the Ministry of Economic Development and Infrastructure and Employment, and now have 3 courses happening in the province, one in Kingston, one in Ottawa, and we just finished one in Barrie. We have waiting list of hundreds of people across the province, unfortunately, and even when we went through the interview process, not all of the folks could be chosen to participate. So we definitely know there's a need for this, so I'm on the search now for more funding to continue this further.
Do you attract a similar clientele or a similar group of folks to Sarah's practice, or?
I would say yes. My population is 18 to 28, so a little bit younger.
Okay.
I would also say that it's a bit different in that some of my folks, they are not able to pay for fee for service, and since this program is subsidized, they can access it. Also, some have really been had limited experiences since high school. For instance, 2 to 3 to 5 years or longer. You know, the typical story that you hear is graduating to your parents' couch in the basement. Unfortunately, well, some of my folks are definitely in that position. So, but a broad range like Sarah presented as well.
Okay. So we talked about this transition being challenging for anyone making the move. What are some of the core issues that affect those on the spectrum?
Right. Well, some of the folks that I see have significant challenges. One are organizational issues. They have difficulties with executive functioning, so organizing, prioritizing, and this is a lifelong struggle. Lack of employment experience. Since they were so focused on getting through secondary school, many have had no experience, even volunteer experiences or experiences in the workplace, right? Social maturation lags by, I'm going to say, 3 to 4 years minimum. So that presents with significant challenges. And since social communication challenges are a critical issue for them, they have limited social engagement, so tend to step back into themselves and not get out there in the environment and meet new people. So they're very socially isolated. Sarah could certainly talk about the issues with anxiety and depression, because I know the Red Path Center deals with many of those, and I see that all the time.
Yeah, it's common in the population.
Very, very common in the population. Comes with the territory, let's say. Right?
And the outcome, Sarah, is there's some staggering stats, right? This is a real problem.
Yeah, so a study that, that Red Path conducted with a handful of community partners a few years ago looked at 400 people from across Ontario, urban, rural, and unfortunately 87% of those adults, young adults, 16 plus, were underemployed or unemployed completely.
So much of our audience is not coming here for the first time. You've watched some of our past webinars and dealing with professionals like Patricia and Sarah. And one of the things that comes up often at every stage of the game is this question around disclosure and the role that it plays. So when talking about this transition, what role does disclosure play? What are some of the concerns around disclosure?
Sure. So a lot of times when people are coming to see me, they're not necessarily entering into a very structured program, but it's customized one-on-one. So not every person will disclose. Some individuals are on a very professional track, and they feel that may jeopardize the work that they do. Others really need to disclose. For example, somebody who has some repetitive behaviors like hand flapping, for example. If they're doing a lot of that in an interview, that's going to kind of trigger the interviewer to think, what's going on there? So it really depends. My best practice is, if you choose not to disclose, it's still very important to let somebody know, let your human resources or the person interviewing you, wherever you're at in the stage, let them know that you have at least a different learning style, and try to self-advocate and let that employer know what you need to make some simple accommodations, because very rarely do people I meet struggle with the actual tasks of the job. It's very rarely an issue of I can't do what I'm supposed to be doing in my job,
right.
but more so the social issues, which is very unique to autism.
Okay, and we're going to be talking about that, but that's not atypical for anyone, right? You go for a job, you say, I have a young child, I can't be here before 8 o'clock, or whatever it might be. It'd be very similar. On this desk, we've talked about disclosure a lot at different stages where we're dealing with young children all the way through to young adults. And a lot of people have said, always disclose, always disclose. Is that the rule when you get into employment, or?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Right? I think it's an individual choice, and I think it has to be the person's choice.
Right.
We as coaches can guide them and support them in their choice, but it is up to them. Now, that being said, in the Transition to Life program, the vast majority of folks do disclose because we're actually supporting them through the process. So we're showing up with them at the interview, right? And sometimes we're job coaching. So, you know, it's, It's a different situation, but in individual coaching situations, I think it's a choice.
We already got our first question, so I think I'm going to go to it. This is a little bit off, I think, what we're talking about today, but I'm sure one of you can help us. I know my young adult probably has autism, and it might be affecting his employment search. How do I go about getting a diagnosis?
Sarah's the gal to talk to. I think it.
So this is a young adult. So if there's somebody who has not been diagnosed when they're much younger, lots of times it is quite challenging to figure out a way to actually arrive at a diagnosis as an adult.
Okay.
There are a handful of clinicians across Ontario, typically psychologists, who would most often be doing a diagnosis, but a lot of times those would be more fee-for-service to access a diagnosis. But connecting, usually I would say, with your local Autism Ontario chapter is huge.
Okay.
And also your local mental health supports as well, because a lot of times some of the ways that ASD might manifest in adulthood might look like anxiety, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So you want to be tapping into both sources and start by talking to your family doctor too.
Right, okay.
And ensure the psychologist has a background in ASD.
Absolutely.
Right.
That's really important because it's not that common.
Right.
Real quick, for this person, what do you do? Just ask if they have a background, or is that a place where Autism Ontario can help direct to the proper?
They can direct, I'm sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Social issues are something that we hear a lot about.
Huge.
And come up a great deal. Talk to me about how social issues affect in the workplace.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned before, lots of times it's not the actual job tasks that are the challenge, it's more the social piece.
Right.
And again, it's going to look different for everyone, but I know that I do a lot of work around social anxiety to help people prepare for some of those pieces, because lots of times they're so stuck in not knowing what to say or how to say it, or have had a past experience in bullying, rejection, those sorts of things. So there's a lot more mentally going on than just not having the skills.
Okay.
But in addition, people struggle with the skills too. So I know both of the work that we do, we're very heavily involved in helping people get the social supports that they need. Specifically in a workplace, you don't need to be best friends with the whole team, but you need to have one or two people that you can bounce ideas off of.
Okay.
A mentor is amazing. And negotiate the social and take some breaks when you need social breaks. You don't have to eat lunch every single day with your peers, sort of thing.
Pat, how do some of these social issues manifest themselves in the workplace? What are some of the things that someone might do if they're not coached appropriately?
Often talk too much, and sometimes about personal issues. Too much information, people don't want to hear it.
Yeah.
They can also maybe not respond in appropriate ways, right? Responding to email, that's huge in this population. For some reason, they do not like to respond to email. They feel that information has been received, and we should be good. But so it's those small etiquette pieces, and I really work on just teaching social skills that are good enough.
Okay.
You don't have to be a social pro here. It's not going to happen. So look at that individual situation. Try to figure out the skills that they're going to need to navigate that particular situation, then work on generalization. So very specific skills, because there are a lot of skills in the workplace. And this is when disclosure comes in handy too.
I was going to say.
Right? Because then people understand that, there's some differences here, and we accept that.
Yeah. There's a webinar that we did a few months back on the Peers program, which really gives some great examples, I think, of some of the stuff that you brought up as some of the issues, and is a good starting point to start understanding some of the things that you can do to help work on these A little out of order here in what I wanted to talk about, but something that we hear, again, a lot about is the theory of the mind. How does that come into the transitional?
Yeah. So what, as Pat was mentioning earlier, there's a lot of people who don't have experience. Maybe they've just worked on getting through high school, or some of the clients I work with, college and university, and they make it through the education, but during that time, it's really difficult for them to multitask and do extra things in the community, whether it be volunteering, co-op, working a part-time job. So a lot of times it's really tricky for these individuals to put themselves in someone else's shoes and think about, if I was a lawyer, for example, what would my day look like? Would I be in trial every single day, or would there be prep? And these sorts of things, breaking down what someone else's day may be like and what kind of emotions they may have in relation to those kinds of things is really, really tricky.
Yeah, I can imagine it. And then not knowing that, like what does this cause in the workplace, or what challenges does this provide them?
I think it makes people really stuck way before the workplace. It gets them stuck at, I don't know what I want to do, or there's nothing I want to do.
Which would be the worst case scenario, I guess, right? So that raises a great talk point about the match, right? Finding the right match, the right job for an individual. I know I said earlier in our pre-interview I wanted to be a movie star. That didn't work out. Now I'm here. But what are some of the challenges that you face with those on the spectrum looking for that right match of job to individual?
So what I find is that lots of times that lack of knowledge, they don't really know where to start, what to do. They don't know what kinds of options are available to them. So getting them some career assessment tools is really important, and wherever possible, having that done by someone like Pat or myself or some sort of school, whether it be your high school or your college or university. One great tool is career cruising, which is free to even access at the local library if you're not currently in school. And then I always mention one of my favorite websites, just to get more information. If you're not at a point where you can even think about, do I like this more than this? Just getting some data as a starting point from the website on the screen there, onetonline.org, is a great way to get started.
And go to the resource section at the bottom of the console, and there you will be able to grab these resources and many others. One great piece of advice my dad gave me was make sure you love what you do. I know that those on the spectrum can get really, really focused and really into things. Does that hold true when looking for a job?
Well, there's a debate about that, I think, in the autism community, because certainly they have very specific interests that are obsessive at times, and often, because of that, they're experts in the field, right? So, I mean, you cannot deny that, and so you have to explore that. But the trick is you have to make it into something that could be employable. Right? So sometimes, yes, that's the case. Sometimes not so much. But I often do maps of things that could be connected to it, so that you do hone in to their interests. Because if you ignore their interests, I think you're going to have difficulty. Right? But I think you have to expand them as well.
And I guess that's what some of those resources that you referenced earlier and they can access will help do. A question from a parent here is, are the resources that we're referencing to assist in I guess finding work, are those things that my child should be doing themselves, or is this a guided process?
Right. So I'd say for any of the more formal career assessment tools, like what you see in sort of the first half of the slide, it is great if you can be tapping into people who have a background in that. Because they know sort of, if you have this 5 options in a page that are really good careers for your son or daughter, that doesn't mean that you have to do only these 5 jobs kind of thing. They're sort of a little bit more trained to adapt, well, what's similar to this, and where can we take this, and it's not setting any lines in sand, in stone, I should say. So I think, yes, you should have help with that. But the website at the bottom is a great place to just start to get some information. Even just bouncing ideas off of a parent or family member, teacher, that sort of thing is really good too. So there's definitely a role for family at this stage for sure.
A couple more audience questions here. My daughter doesn't understand that sometimes she needs to work as part of a team. It's hard for her. She doesn't always see the point because she receives ODSP. As a parent, I do not want her to miss out, but it's hard to get her to understand that working with others is good for her. Any suggestions there?
Yeah, it's a tough one because working in teams is part of what I do in Transition to Life. That's part of the course.
Yeah.
You need to be able to work in teams to be a successful community member. And so usually with somebody who's really resistant, I'll start them off in a small in a small way, so that they're only working with somebody else, just one other person to do a project between them, and then broadening that. Or maybe just starting off playing games, right? It depends on where the person's at, because anytime you put two people together, you're working as a team.
Right.
So you don't want to put this person to work in a team of 10, obviously.
Right.
You want to gradually increase the opportunities that they have to work with other people.
Okay.
And starting with preferred activities is often very positive.
And this is a common issue.
It is a common issue. It comes,
Our son has been out of high school for 3 years. He has been at home mostly since then. He has recently been getting stuck and frustrated and experiencing angry outbreaks. Part of it may be boredom. He spends most of the day in front of the TV, which we see a lot, and he requires support to get out and into life. Where should this person start? I know we got a whole section on this, but in that situation where they're stuck, what advice would you give for them to get started?
It's tricky without knowing much more about this person, so maybe we can say, stick with us for a little bit and we'll give you some ideas.
Because by the end of today, they should have some ideas.
Right.
If not, come back and ask us more questions.
Yeah.
All right, fair enough. We talked a little bit about it, but let's talk about where to go to start looking. So maybe even in this case, starting the job search, where do you go to start?
Well, this particular question, going back to, I think the person mentioned that their child was on ODSP.
Yeah.
So there's ODSP employment supports as a possibility, which is a lot of people don't know about. They take the income supports and don't tap into the employment supports. So that's a possibility.
Yeah.
Talk to a caseworker to get more information. I often encourage people to start at their local employment resource centers. And certainly they're not geared at supporting people with special needs.
Right.
They're generalists, sort of, and no door is a wrong door is a philosophy. But there's definitely some gaps there in understanding around autism. So it's something I'd certainly suggest people consider approaching, but going in, making sure that you're very open about the diagnosis and what that means for your child, so that the intake worker and the employment counselors that would be in those situations would have a bit of a better sense as to what that would mean for helping your son or daughter.
And I think that's probably an important point. We're going to talk about later about the challenge in getting formalized support for this transition in the province of Ontario right now. You guys are great examples of that, but you are only in a few regions of the province. If someone is walking in cold into an employment resource center, what are some of the strategies that you would suggest for them, Pat?
Well, I would say that I don't think I'd walk in cold, for starters.
Well, that's good.
I would make a connection with them and explain the situation, explain the background of the person involved.
Right.
And I wouldn't expect the young adult to do this independently. I would expect them to do it as a team, so that there is some background information available on the person and sort of what they need. To expect any young adult to do that is difficult, but to expect somebody with ASD to do it independently it's not going to happen.
And
I don't think.
Yeah.
I mean, my general
Yeah.
impression.
Is the parent the right person to go with them? Is there others that might be better suited to make that trip?
Well, I'll speak to the Transition to Life program just for a moment here, but we do help them in that regard, right? So we make those connections. The folks know something about ASD when our people come, and we do support them in that process. I think that's ideal, but somebody should be with them, and I don't know if there's an ideal person, somebody who knows them best, who understands their challenges, and who will support them over time.
Okay.
And I think that's too where Autism Ontario is definitely a key part of empowering and helping the local employment agencies that are more generalists around supporting people in finding work. So I know, for example, I was in London, Ontario last weekend presenting out to that chapter, and they have a great partnership with one of the local employment resource agencies. That one's called Hutton House.
Right.
And so when people come through Autism Ontario in London, Ontario, and they're looking to find work, well, there's this partnership already in place where they're connecting and referring, and so that when there's questions that come up around, I don't really understand this whole ASD thing, then there's a support that's very knowledgeable already in place.
you're already here, so clearly you're aware of Autism Ontario. You've been to the website. That's how you get on these webinars. But a theme that you'll consistently hear about is they really are, that website and those groups and the local chapters really hold this community together and are a great resource to find out, what's the best employment service to walk into, or what, where to go next when you're experiencing these things. Another tough one for you, Sarah, coming from the audience. I'm not sure there's enough here, but so this parent believes that their son their son is dealing with anxiety, and that's the reason that they're having issues transitioning and going out and looking for employment. When anxiety seems to be the core reason, what would you suggest that they start doing?
We were just kind of talking about this right before we came on set, is just that sometimes people, as much as you want them to be working and as much as you know that that's going to help with their depression or anxiety, sometimes you really do need to start by addressing the anxiety piece first.
Okay.
So that may look like, if it's social anxiety, a social anxiety group. It may look like cognitive behavioral therapy with a one-on-one counselor of some sort. But definitely that needs to be addressed, because you don't want to have a false start and then have that person get discouraged because something didn't work out with employment because they weren't ready, and then they're sort of really draw themselves in, and they're in a much worse place than they may have been beforehand.
But get them busy.
Yeah.
At the same time, doing meaningful tasks. I mean, I deal with a lot of people that require additional supports. I mean, this is a complex area, right? But I always get them busy, right?
It makes sense. So let's talk, you've already brought it up a couple times. Let's dig in and let's talk about all the success that you've been having with transition to life.
I thought you'd never ask. No.
We knew it was coming. It's important for people to learn, what happens when they are going through a program. And you've had success in improving independence, social opportunities, but most importantly, really, employment skills, success stories of people going out who couldn't before and are out making that transition. Talk to us about how Transition to Life works. Like, what is the program?
So this program is a 12-week program, and it's 3 hours a week of in-class work where they're spending a lot of time working with team members, right, and learning how to learn in that environment. And there's a real key focus on readiness for life and readiness for work kind of skills. Okay. This is reinforced in individualized coaching, which is offered weekly, and it's probably on average 2 hours a week.
Wow.
And so it's pretty intensive kind of support. First of all, it's just focusing on ensuring that people understand the course material, but it also looks at the transitional issues that individual is facing, right? And comes up with some goals and a plan for the future. So that when they finish the course, they should have a better understanding of a direction that they want to go in. There's a lot of assignments, so homework's mandatory, but they're very practical in nature. So it's
Give
not
me an example. What's a practical
So for
assignment?
instance, they have to seek employment. So every week there's an employment strand that has to be addressed in their homework. It might be finding 3 references. It might be working on a covering letter. It might be practicing for the interview that's coming up. But each person weekly has an employment focus within the homework as well as other things. 1 week they're asked to incorporate 3 physical activities, which isn't their favorite thing, I've got to say, into their schedule 3 times a week to increase, to increase their physical activity. Community involvement. They have to go out into the community and join something. And if they're already if they're already involved in a church group, that's great. If they're already going to the library, that's all right. But those are the kinds of things we're talking about. What else? There's always social opportunities that are provided weekly because these folks really need that and they want that, right? So at my center, there's a Thursday night social club. And there's a variety of different things that happen there. Really important part of the program is the fact that I have mentors who have been successful in the transition process themselves, maybe a little bit older, late 20s, and they have successfully navigated either post-secondary education or the workplace, and they come and present their stories weekly.
Okay.
And so that first-person perspective is really important. In the Barrie group this time around, I had a young guy and a young gal, and people listen to them far more than they listen to me. I got to tell you, right? Because they've lived it and they've been successful. So that's an important part. Every person at the end of the program comes out with a volunteer, a supported, or a paid work placement, and we assist step by step. Getting them into that situation. The last point's important because we're trying to get this as evidence-based as possible, right? And so there's a research component that's happening in all of the courses wherein the parents and the participants are completing research documents, and at this point York University's having a look at those, and we've had a round completed already. So, you know, that's sort of transition to life in a nutshell. Okay.
Before we get flooded with how do I sign up and all of that, I think it's important that there's a criteria for involvement. Can you take us through that real quick?
Sure. So each of the individuals involved range between the ages of 18 and 28 years of age. They had a document diagnosis this past number of rounds of Asperger's syndrome. That may change due to the DSM criteria change, but we're looking at people that have been successful in the high school setting, in an applied setting, or in an academic setting. Okay? So they have to be able to understand the materials. They have to have a high level of motivation to meet the program goals. Now, sometimes it's not as high as I'd like it to be, but you know, if parents are dragging them in kicking and screaming, I'm thinking it's not time. Right? It's not time, because you're going to have to work at this. I'm not doing all the work. So we have to make sure there's some commitment. Parent commitment is necessary, and oftentimes when they reach this age, parents are sort of out of the picture. Like when they go to post-secondary, parents aren't supposed to be accessing, you know, the information without specialized signatures and supports. Anyway, I sign a contract, parents are involved, individuals involved, I'm involved, and because they're going to be there long after the 12-week course is finished, right? So they have to be in for the long haul, and mandatory attendance and weekly assignment completion, and we really are on to them about that. It's not like, yo, you can do it if you want. No. Right? We check it all the time, and they have to be able to attend the course and the employment placement independently. So that's the key criteria. We can support them in the process, but we don't hold hands totally.
And it's available right now, you said, in Kingston, Ottawa, and Barrie?
In Barrie, and the Barrie course is just finished, so Kingston and Ottawa have two teams there that are offering it right now that I've trained, and they're doing a fantastic job. They're in there making all the connections with local communities, and I'm down there monitoring it weekly from afar.
And Sarah, one thing that I've heard very similar is a lot of the one-on-one. Very important. And a lot of your program or your practice is one-on-one and specialized as well. Compare and contrast a little bit. What's it like when someone comes to see you at the Redpath Center?
So it's actually very similar in a number of ways. So the only difference is that majority of the work that I do is one-to-one versus it being group-based. And so I think that has its pros and its cons to it. I think sometimes when you're in a group environment, sometimes that's more motivating. Oh, they're doing the homework, I got to do mine kind of thing. So I think I see people who are sometimes in a bit more of a pre-employment stage where they may not be quite as ready for a group yet. And sometimes they've actually, in Toronto, there are a number of different supports that are available, and sometimes they come to me because they've been deemed ineligible at some of the other services. They're just not quite there yet. So it's just breaking it down and customizing one-on-one what things might look like. Some major similarities are the homework. There's always going to be homework because this person's trying to get closer to working, and if they're working, they're going to be the ones who are there doing the job, not me, not Pat, not all the coaches. Another huge similarity is a parent involvement or a spouse. A lot of people I see, it might be a spouse as well as somebody who is helping them stay organized with the tasks and that sort of thing. And then I think another difference too is that yes, there's the employment and the volunteer as the outcomes, but for many people I see, their outcome also may look like returning to school. So a lot of people I work with, maybe they did a little bit of college or something and didn't really connect to it and they stopped attending. It's maybe sometimes re-enrolling or even enrolling in a postgraduate and helping them figure out, yes, I'm really into this one-year program that's in environmental studies. I never knew that before when I was doing that general arts and science kind of stuff. So it's really gearing them up to figure out what they want to be doing long-term too.
the questions are flooding in, and we always like to answer their questions. So the next one that I've got here are, what are some of the common accommodations that employers can make to support someone on the spectrum in the workplace?
I can say a little bit, and then you jump in from.
Sure.
So just firstly, just to warm up to that topic, I think a lot of employers think, oh my gosh, this person has ASD, I don't know anything about it.
Right.
It's going to cost me hundreds and hundreds of dollars, maybe even more than that.
Yeah.
But the reality is that the average accommodation for anybody, whether it be physical disability or something more like ASD, is $200.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's quite the discrepancy from what employers may think.
Yeah.
But go ahead. If you
It's
wanna
just writing down instructions, right?
Yeah.
Instead of verbalizing all the time,
Okay.
so that they have something to rely on after the person leaves.
Right.
It's structuring jobs in a way that they understand it, and ensuring that they understand what the task is before they're left. It's that understanding about social in the workplace, and you know, they may not be as social as everybody else.
Right.
You know, it's some basic things like that, and then it's some accommodations that may affect the job, the particular job that have to be looked at, right? So that would vary from employment situation. But what I'll do is, I do have a resource that I hand out to employers that's sort of 10 top tips.
Okay.
And I'm not sure if I've provided that to Autism Ontario, but I'll put it up there so this person can access that. 'Cause this is sort of the basics, right?
Yeah. And for any of these resources that maybe aren't there yet, the Knowledge Center at Autism Ontario is where you would find this stuff. A bunch of the stuff we're referencing today, if it's not in our resource section, will be in that Knowledge Center. I would like to get my 23-year-old son into a program like Transition to Life, but with his anxiety, I cannot get him out of the house at all. You talk about each participant being willing. How do I get my son to see the importance of these kinds of programs? Yeah, I mean, this sounds like a little bit about sometimes when people come to see you is to get ready to move into a situation like Pat offers. But if they're not seeing the value...
Well, it's a chicken-egg situation, right? Because the more you are at home, the more anxious you become.
Right.
So it's baby steps. In my mind, out to something.
Yeah.
And then building on that.
Yeah.
So it feels like a more fluid transition. But if it's just, you know, you're too anxious, so we'll just let you be, it won't improve the circumstance. It'll never get better. So it's time to just begin initially. Plus, the person may need to see, you know, may need to see a psychologist or a doctor.
Right.
May need medication adjusted.
Absolutely.
Oftentimes, these folks do need medication, right? And that's something we haven't talked about. Or sometimes the medication hasn't been looked at since they were 7.
Right.
Yeah.
And now there's a whole series of medications, and it's time for a review. So those two things is what I would suggest.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree.
And I'm sure meeting, like you have the mentor program, but speaking to someone who may be on the spectrum and has had the success, like, or I don't know, a bunch of interesting stuff came up in our pre-interview about the stuff you're doing to get people out, speaking to employers without maybe not interviewing, but just speaking and seeing what it can look like.
Right.
Okay, this is one more question, and then we will move on. But what are the key things that job developers can do to encourage employers to consider and hire individuals with ASD?
There's one, so job developers, for those who don't know, those are the people that when you're doing some sort of employment counseling program, those are the people that would actually be the ones advocating to employers on behalf of the individual, helping them schedule an interview and letting them know a little bit about what ASD is.
Yeah.
So there's this one really good report that I have in the resources, and it lists a ton of stats around hiring people with disabilities, around like that thing that I was mentioning about the cost of accommodations, how little they are. So I would dispel any myths about what someone might be thinking in terms of hiring someone with disability. And then I would just make really certain that you've got exactly what, it's going back to that disclosure slide earlier on, breaking down what that person with ASD might need in a workplace and advocating on their behalf around that. Because it might just be things like having some notes in advance for a meeting. It might be things like if it's a safe work environment, maybe a desk environment, allowing them to have headphones on.
Right.
It's being really upfront and honest about what their accommodations are likely going to look like, so there's no fear of the unknown.
Okay.
And talking about their strengths.
Right.
Like that's one thing we haven't addressed here today.
Yeah.
But I couldn't be in this field unless I saw this incredible number of strengths.
Right.
Right? So I think job developers should really focus on how punctual they are, how trustworthy they are, how detail-oriented, all of those positive things, how creative in their thinking they are, right? So I think that's a really strong focus.
Yeah, and that article talks a lot about that. So it looks at work retention, how someone with a disability is likely to stay in that job a little bit longer than the average person.
Right.
They're likely to have better attendance.
Business case.
Be on time. Yeah.
Make the business case.
Hugely a business case.
And I think you're right. I mean, the number one assumption would be, that there is a cost to being an employer that brings us on, but there's other benefits. I mean,
Huge.
any response for RFP that you ever have to contribute to, it asks questions about, are you equal opportunity? Do you, do you have programs like this in place? So there's additional benefits to certain organizations as well.
There's definitely a movement that's starting, that's just starting to rumble about not looking at hiring someone as ASD as a charity case, but looking at it as this is sound for your business. This person's going to bring way more benefit. If you can make one or two small changes that are not very significant, you're going to get a ton out of this person. They're going to be better than the average employee.
Right. So this is important. We talked about, this wraps in a bunch of the stuff that we had talked about, but let's try and synthesize it for our audience. Disclosure sounds important so that you can take advantage of the positives while getting some of these, call it concessions, to help you do it. So we already talked about it once, but what do you do to help someone disclose? What are the steps that you guys take when going into that job interview? Pat, you go out with them, right?
Yeah, we're very directly involved.
Right.
And so they actually write a disclosure letter as part of the course. And so they're aware of how to proceed, but as we go into a job interview, we've made the connection previously.
Right.
So they're fully aware what this person's strengths are and what their challenges are, and they're very open in the interview to accommodations.
Okay. And yourself?
I think it depends. Some people that I work with, like I mentioned earlier, they need to disclose prior to an interview, but a lot of times I'll encourage people if they don't have if they're okay in the interview stage and the need is not immediate at that point in time, I encourage them to wait until they're already hired, because I would hate to see someone discriminated against, and you can never really prove why someone was not interviewed. If there's 100 resumes, it's really hard to make a case why one person wouldn't have received an interview. So disclosing either at the time that they're offered the employment or early on into the job, or right away into their training. And it looks different for each person depending on the job. So so it's tricky to say.
Okay. I got a question here from somebody. I'm 32 and I cannot get a job. I've been searching for a year. Nobody wants to hire me because I was fired from my last job. Over that year, I've only had one interview. It's been very discouraging. Any suggestions where I should start?
So I would say rescripting on why did you get fired from that job? Does that need to be on your resume? Is there a different way that you can look at how to word what happened there? And I would also say that doing something in addition to job searching is really key. So maybe it's getting a volunteer position. If, say, you're trying to work in IT, maybe it's volunteering, doing some website stuff for a company while you are still looking for work, because you need a positive reference if the last one was not so great.
Right.
And you need to see that on the resume. You don't want to see a big gap.
Gaps
Right.
are not good.
Yes, that's a red flag, definitely.
Right.
Okay, so at Transition to Life, you mentioned earlier when we were talking that it's like a college kind of setting.
Well, we work out of colleges in the province. So the reason for this is to give the folks experience in that setting. Some people have had experience in the setting, but others haven't. So as a result of having that experience with peers, they often decide that might be something that they want to do.
Right.
Now, that being said, I think that everyone should just take a bit of a breather after high school and not necessarily go directly into the post-secondary setting, because they're just often not ready. But be very engaged in their communities or employed or something in the meantime.
There's a risk there, right? Not going directly.
Right.
Of what happens with that
most
critical
people want
time.
them. You know, most people would love their child to go directly to college or university. The folks that I'm seeing haven't been successful. Often. And they're very discouraged. Because if you're 18 but you're socially emotionally 14, you're not ready. Right? So I find the older folks are doing better at college and university. Plus, by then, they've had the opportunity to search out the jobs that they're interested in and the career that they want to, be engaged in. Yeah. But having them at the college university just gets them thinking about different opportunities. And out of how many people, I'd say that 5 or 6 out of the classes that I've taught have then decided to go sort of immediately to post-secondary after taking it, because they've been there, then they started researching, became an interest. So I do think being at the colleges to teach the course, we're not part of the colleges, but to teach the course is a very important component of it.
Yeah. Came up again, one of the reasons, the social, and we talked about it as a core issue earlier. We got some slides here showing some of the stuff that you guys do there. I know the importance of it, but what are some of the practical things you're doing to help improve the social awareness?
Well, people think that people on the spectrum aren't social or don't like to socialize, and I can definitely prove that wrong, because this is my center in Barrie, and I started off with a group called the Spectrum Connection a number of years ago, 2010, with 3 people, and now we have, and that was just once a month activity. Now we have a weekly activity, and it's called the Social Club. And they do all kinds of different things. But on average, now I think I have 45 people coming and going.
What kind of things happen at this?
Well, it depends on what they want to do. So every Thursday, 6:30 to 8:30 is set aside for them, and we make plans month by month. But their preferred activities, games night. The game that you're seeing there is some complex game that I'll never understand, because they're way smarter than me. When it comes to this kind of thing, they really are into games. So this is games and pizza night. There's also an outing in the community every month. So they went rock climbing last month. We're going to Wasaga Beach. So that is once a month as well. And then there's other things, like there's girls and guys night out, and they choose what they're going to do, right? Guys sometimes play poker or whatever, or strategy games, and girls often do more girlish things like make jewelry or whatever. But and then there's always a movie night with a theme. Tomorrow night's Disney, so they'll all bring Disney movies and decide what they're going to watch. But they'll all dress up like Mickey Mouse Club, and it'll be
Star Wars.
Or Star Wars is huge. Spider-Man, like they really have these interests that carry over to their social life. So the great thing is it's a safe place to be. Everybody there is on the spectrum, and not necessarily Asperger's, across the spectrum. And so they really are good supports to each other, but they engage in the community from here. So they all make connections with each other to do things like go to Comic-Con, whatever it might be, right?
Sarah, so you don't have the benefit of the group setting. You're doing it differently, but you have the same issues. What do you do to help with the social
I think around social, there's no way around it without being in a community kind of based setting with other people. So we actually at Red Path do run social anxiety and social skills groups. It's a bit more structured, whereas this is like you're going in and you're kind of deciding the activities. This is sort of like a pre-step to that, where the first half of the program breaks down some thoughts that people might have about themselves and anxieties that they may have in being social. And then the second half of the group is all skill building. And we had a games night just this past Monday. And then we do an outing to a restaurant. So every time we run those groups, it's myself and a behavior therapist that run them together usually. And they are, they're always full. And we run them every season pretty much. So
someone who doesn't have the means or isn't in Toronto and is on your 100-plus person waiting list, what are some recommendations for parents to do to get them out doing these sorts of things?
Start a social group.
Yourself? Just go out and make it happen?
I mean, work with Autism Ontario, because oftentimes there are already groups set up now, and it's just beginning to be more popular, but definitely that's how I started, was with a social group, and if you start a social group, they will come eventually, right? Because I think I had 2 to 3 that I began with. The other thing that I encourage a lot of people to do, and it looks a little bit different in more of the rural communities, but there's a website called Meetup.com. And that's where a lot of people, like whatever you're interested in, if it's sci-fi books, or whether it is video gaming, or whether it's a hiking, whatever it may be, you can find a group in the GTA, especially because there's just so many people. So it's more likely that you're going to find people sharing a common interest. Nothing to do with ASD, but you just go out, and if you're connecting with people around something that you actually like,
it's going to be a heck of a lot more enjoyable as a starting step versus, you know, something that is more like a social norm kind of activity that people going to a party. That's hard for a lot of people. But going on a hike, if you love hiking and you want to talk about birds and you like the same kind of bird, that's a lot easier to get started with.
Right. You've dropped the word a bunch of times, and both of you have, as it relates to this, the community. You do a lot of work in the community at your program. What does that look like?
Well, as part of the Transition to Life program, as I told you earlier, we make sure that each person is in the community doing a variety of different things, like what Sarah was saying. Or some people aren't quite as ready to join groups, so they might just go to the library once a week or twice a week. Right. So you really have to look at where each person is at in terms of that, encouraging them. But to me, that's so important because it takes you out of yourself into the greater community, thinking about other people, right? And so this is just a community walk. So it can vary, but community involvement and having our folks involved with all these different employers in the community has been a tremendous support for them, right? So they're seeing as they get out there, hey, this isn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. They're working in different organizations and having success. And so community is important.
And I understand there's a really strong community has been built in the GTA anyways around, maybe it's not around the Red Path Center, but you guys are associated with it. That makes this easier. Can you talk about some of the connections that have been made? Yeah,
so I mean, in the Toronto region, there's definitely close to, I think, 20 or so local employment agencies that sit around a table that are starting to talk and communicate for the first time about here's what we're doing, and there's a broader sort of body that kind of monitors it and shares job opportunities amongst the different partners. So yeah, that's really cool and new, and I think something that's not happening everywhere yet.
No, Ottawa it's happening in Ottawa as well. Just because somebody reached out to me this past week to see if we'd sit on that, so that's very encouraging.
Right.
I've got a question here from our audience. I'm worried about my child's mental health in relation to looking for work. Do you have any thoughts on the impact of mental health with ASD and transition?
Yeah. You go ahead.
Okay, well, yeah, I think that mental health is the priority, right? Yeah. So I wouldn't put the work ahead of the mental health, especially paid employment. I think I would have someone have a very close look. I don't know what mental health means to this person. We're not sure, but it must be significant to say that. So I think that the mental health always takes the priority. Like at the beginning of my course, I just do some basic assessment to determine if a person is really depressed. And if they are, it doesn't mean they can't come into the course, because we welcome them with open arms, but they need more support than me. Right? And so that determination, I think, needs to be made with this particular individual to see the kinds of supports they need. And once again, getting out into the community in small ways that are successful will help move the person down the road.
Right. And that's common, right? Like throughout the school system, it's not just the educators or the parents' responsibility. There's always, you know, a mental health professional should be involved. Okay, so we've got about 8 minutes left. Just want to give you guys a bit of a time check here. Continue to submit your questions through the question box, and I will get you the answers, or we'll get them to you later. But one thing that we do need to talk about, and that is the state of support in the province. We're here today because there isn't a lot. You guys are pillars in the community. Parents need to know who can't just, because not everyone out there is going to be able to access your programs. So what are some recommendations for what parents can do to advocate for an improvement in this scenario?
Let's start with what they can do themselves. Can I say that?
Yeah,
is
what
that
can they do
okay?
themselves?
What can they do themselves? Everybody wants their child to be as independent as possible, right? I mean, there's no doubt about that. So I think they need to start thinking long before the transition actually occurs about the skills that are required to be independent.
Okay.
All right, so if, for instance, your child isn't able to use public transportation and they're 16, that to me would be a definite goal, because you want them to be able to independently get around, you know, the city or the town that you live in. Those kinds of things, cooking for themselves, hygiene, you know, and then breaking them down, just not saying, you need to go and you need to go and take the bus now.
Yeah.
It has to be very specific into SMART goals with time limits.
Right.
So by the end of this summer, you will be able to take the bus to, let's say, the mall,
Right.
independently, by yourself. But that's a process.
Yeah.
So they'll have to help them step by step, or somebody will, right?
Right.
I often have my mentors work with people that don't have those skills.
Right.
So find somebody that's in the community that can help take them on through some of those skills too, right?
And that's, so start early and get them
Yeah.
doing it. But what happens to those that maybe, you know, didn't start early?
Right.
So
That's okay.
so you're seeing them, they come right out of university. If they didn't do any of this, still take it in steps, like Pat said. What's your suggestion there?
Yeah, I think that we know that with ASD, breaking things down to small, manageable steps is always the approach that helps many, many people learn best. And so I think that you've got to do it at that time. And, you know, I had somebody who was 25 years old never call her doctor before, but the fact that mom says call the doctor now, that doesn't really just translate. So she picks up the phone and makes that call. So we had to build in some staggered pieces as to this time you're going to listen to your mom make that appointment for you.
Right.
And then next time you're going to write some notes as to what you think would be said, and going on from there. So it's still a similar thing. But I think the piece that we need to touch upon is building up people to help with that when you're young. So whether it be in the school or in the community, supports maybe, you know, at your local ASD agency that's doing the ABA therapy, that sort of thing. Who's helping? And how are you advocating for these things and prioritizing what the goals should be when the younger the better.
Parents struggling with this, if there was the best option for helping to structure that, where would that come from, you think?
The best option to okay, I think that I don't know. I don't think there is one best option.
Okay.
Do you?
Well, I think it's transition life. Yeah, I'm going to speak. I think it needs to be something very structured over time. It's not like a one-time fix.
Yeah.
And if parents, they're not going to have access to that, it's the same kind of routine that I'm thinking.
Okay.
Like a meaningful schedule set up, incorporating all of these variety of things that people need to know. And it's like you're going to school now, but you're not in school, right? And also a huge thing is to build something in that really lights their fire.
Right.
Okay, because if you just say, now we're in the Army now, you have to do all these activities, you're an adult, you're not going to see them move forward. Their motivations are much different than ours, right? So you have to look at what builds their self-concept, because as they enter the adult years, I find they walk in and they're not feeling so good about themselves, right? So those things that they have loved to do, and beyond video games, okay, because they all really like video games, but it has to be over and above that. Things that they're interested in, often the arts, often the arts. So find that and get it incorporated into the schedule.
I've got a couple questions here from our audience. Please keep them coming. We're going to try to get as many answers as possible. What are the options for the adults who graduated from life skills beyond accessing the typical employment options of working retail and fast food? Like my son. They have proven strong work ethic and independent abilities. They want the opportunity to work in an area that meets their interest and their talents and get them excited to get up and get out every day.
I wonder about entrepreneurial for a lot of people, because a lot of individuals I meet with do have a lot of success in that. We were talking earlier about very specific interests and that being very meaningful for people.
Right.
So as Pat mentioned, lots of times people have such a refined interest, they're an expert in it more than many, many, many other people. So if that's something that you can turn into something entrepreneurially, that's great. But anytime anyone goes that route, I say that they always need a business partner, whether that be a family member or a spouse or a really trusted friend, because there's a lot of room around tasks that are less desirable, like the bookkeeping for a business perhaps, to really struggle. So I think that's a great option.
And what's this person doing for a volunteer job now? That's where I go and start.
Because you know, when you finish high school and you don't specialize in any other area after that, and you do some great life skills, then those kinds of jobs that were mentioned there are the kind that are most typically and readily available. And going back to school doesn't make sense for everybody. So that idea of trying to build up more experience through volunteering is often the way that the road is paved to actually find employment later on in that area.
Well, I know, like, just in the agency space out there, I mean, there's always 10, 15 interns working. I mean, it's not volunteer, it's different, but they have to do that so that they don't work the same fast food job that this parent's talking about.
Yeah, it's competitive for everybody right now.
It is. I'm a young person with ASD, and I'm having troubles with pressure from my family to move forward. I've had a number of false starts, and I desperately want to move forward, but in a way that will lead to long-term success rather than just being busy for a few months to a year. Is there anything you might suggest for this person?
Wow, this is the person that I'm dealing with every day. Like, and your heart breaks because they're ready to launch, right? And they just don't have the supports. I think this is a question that I would talk to that person about individual. Like, it's more than a 10 words or less. But he's ready. She's ready. Somebody needs to be talking to this person because it's optimum time to move forward.
Where I start is if people feel ready. But they don't know what they want to do. That's where I'll get into the career assessment tool. So then they have that extra confidence because you do an assessment or two, and then it turns out, that one thing I'm interested in that's coming up in a few different places. And now I know from these 10 pages that are printed off from doing these things that there's these routes to doing that. So that's really good if you don't really know what you want to do, but you feel ready. And if you know and you're ready, I often sit down and say, hey, here are the options for getting there, because so many people are like, I could do that. They don't know where to get started at all, and that organization is so hard.
Another thing is this person should understand themselves and understand ASD very well, because then they'll know what their strengths are, right? And even what you were talking about. So those are two places to begin.
Trust the assessments. They help. Call Sarah. Her number will be up at the end. Sarah, you got a great story here about what this transition can look like. We're getting to the end here. I want to end on a positive note.
This is a positive note, and I'm not going to say that it happens with every participant in the Transition to Life program, but this is one of my favorites. So I met a young man last September who was 25 years old, and he had spent the past 5 years as a shut-in. He describes himself as that. And that basically meant he never left his house. He was on a nocturnal schedule, so slept all day and up all night. Very intelligent young man, but very anxious, depressed, and afraid to leave the house. So we started doing some coaching before the Transition to Life program began, and I got him involved slowly in a variety of happenings, volunteer experience, social experiences.
All the things we've been talking about.
All the things I've been talking about. And then he we had his cover letter prepared together. We worked on that. He did an interview, a number of different interviews, informational interviews, and then went to a job fair and felt confident enough to hand his resume to one of the folks, got an interview there, got a second interview, and is now employed full-time. So, I mean, he's really what I consider a success story, but he was totally ready, and he was just off to the races. So one thing that if people want to see his story, they can go on my website because he's up there with his mom. It's a very cool story, but not everybody has that outcome, but I love the story. That's why it's up there.
I think it's important. We've talked about the challenges getting support in the province. We've talked about the core issues affecting those in this transition, and it's great to sort of end with a story like that. Sarah, maybe you can give us some final, if people walk away with just one message from you today, what does that look like?
I think that we need to really just focus on looking at ASD in the workplace as something that is a huge strength for employers, and employers are lucky to be hiring people with ASD, and so just trying to keep that positive enthusiasm around the job search, which is so easy to get discouraged and burnt out by, and parents just keep advocating for your children, getting started as young as possible, I think would really be everything in a nutshell.
Guys, thanks so much for your time today, and thank you all for participating in this webinar. As we mentioned before, there's a lot of you, a lot of questions, and only so much time. So the questions that weren't answered, we're going to aspire to get back to you. This event itself is recorded, being recorded right now, and will be archived on the Autism Ontario website in the webinars section. So that'll be available in the next couple of days. If you know someone who wasn't here today but you think might benefit from this presentation, feel feel free to share the link or come back and watch it yourself later. Along with this posting are a series of other webinars from this series, which I think you'll find helpful and informative. On behalf of Patricia, Sarah, Autism Ontario, and myself, thanks for coming. We look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks.